One of the things that one hears a lot, particularly in ALNAP, but I think probably all of us have heard it, and many of us have probably said it from one time to another, is that the humanitarian world doesn't really change. Nothing really changes. You get, one evaluation, and then 10 years later you get the same evaluation, and basically it's saying the same things. And maybe one of the things that doesn't change very much is the probably understandable predilection of humanitarians to beat up on themselves, because some things do change, and I think perhaps elements of accountability, if one were to look over sort of the short decade between 2003 and 2011, the two HPNs around accountability, you'd actually seen that there have been real and important changes in accountability over that period of time, which is not to say that there isn't a long way to go. But I think it is worth spending a couple of minutes just thinking about what the time traveller from 2003 would see in 2011 that might surprise and gladden their heart. Are we better at using our money and our power more responsibly? And are we better at showing people that we've done so? In terms of showing to donors that basically we have used taxpayers' money to a degree to what we said we would use it for, and to a satisfactory level of quality, are we better? Well, we're certainly doing more. We're certainly trying harder. I mean, if you look at some of the sort of potential indicators of this, evaluations. Obviously, evaluations are not just for accountability purposes, but they are often for accountability purposes. There seem to be more evaluations going on than there were in 2003. The ALNAP ERD, which obviously doesn't have all evaluations, but it does have those of ALNAP members, so it's a fairly good sort of slice. Has had 101 evaluations put in this year, for example. 4 years ago it was round about the 60s, and it's increased every year since then. So more evaluations. Those of you who are in the enviable position of writing reports to donors will probably have noticed that you're doing more of them than you would have been 10 years ago. There seems to be more reporting required, more reporting asked for. There is a concerted push now, of course, particularly in the United Kingdom, but also elsewhere, towards value for money approaches, and so more saying how money has been spent. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of these things are entirely positive, but they are there, and there's more of it about. What about using money in the best interests of disaster-affected populations, so turning the lens and looking in the other direction, and showing disaster-affected populations that we've done so? Well, since the 2003 HPN, there have been 2 revisions of the sphere minimum standards, 2004 and 2011, setting and continually developing and improving upon the basic standards of things that we are accountable to do. There's been the HAP standard, of course, in 2007, I think, HAP standard and accountability. ECB guidance, the Good Enough Guide, the DEC DCAF framework, which is talked about, of course, in this edition of HPN. So there's been a lot of work, a lot of sweat and time has been spent in trying to work out the difficulties of how accountability towards forward accountability or accountability towards disaster-affected populations might be improved. What does that translate into on the ground? I don't have any figures. I don't know if there are any figures available for whether there are programs are objectively more accountable. More programs actually include accountability mechanisms, but there certainly, I have a sense, which I'll share with you, and maybe it's something that we can discuss later, that not only are more programs attempting to incorporate this forward accountability, but they're attempting to do so in a more sophisticated sort of way, and particularly the sort of work that Brian and Gwyn have been looking at, sort of trying to get a rope around everything that's going on in the system, shows that there are some really quite remarkable and creative attempts, particularly I would say in the area of complaints mechanisms, to actually build in robust ways of understanding what the needs of disaster-affected people are, and also allowing disaster-affected people to know whether or not we are meeting those standards and to tell us when we are not. And it certainly seems that humanitarians, when asked the question, do feel that they're more accountable to beneficiaries. Both the 2009 ALNAP State of the Humanitarian System report and the 2010 Humanitarian Accountability HAP report both asked the question. I'm not sure about the exact wording, but they asked the question to in surveys to humanitarian workers, do you feel that we are more accountable? And in both cases, that question has been asked and answered over a period of time, and it suggests that we feel that we are more accountable in the field. So perhaps there is an argument to say that there are more accountability things, there are more attempts to be accountable going on, particularly along, if you like, that kind of sort of the traditional chain of humanitarian action, the pipe of humanitarian action, where resources are transferred from northern taxpayers through donors, through intermediary organisations and to affected populations elsewhere. All along that line, there's action happening. But there's also, and I think one of the things that the Humanitarian Exchange brings out really well is that not only is there more perhaps accountability going on, but it's going in more directions. Rather than this being this sort of traditional tube, this traditional line, the fact that actually humanitarian action has always been, and perhaps increasingly, is more of a web of relationships, is starting to be taken on board more in terms of the accountability relationships as well. Because, and Gwyn was mentioning this just now, the activities that humanitarian actors do, they're interconnected, and results are generally achieved collaboratively. And actually, you know, most people in receipt of humanitarian assistance probably don't really recognise the difference between one white Land Cruiser and another. You know, it all looks kind of a bit the same. So, so there are requirements to recognise that, first of all, because work is collaborative, we need to be jointly accountable. You know, it's not enough for one agency to say, well, we're accountable to beneficiaries. In fact, agencies have to work together around accountability. And we're seeing a lot of work in that area. There could be more work, but certainly, for example, the DEC DCAF framework is one attempt to look at joint accountabilities, to look at collective accountabilities. Although, as Andy Featherstone's article in here points out, there's still quite a long way to go, because it is the collective action problem of the humanitarian system in accountability as much as anywhere else. The other thing, as well as being jointly accountable, the related thing is that I think we're seeing attempts to become more accountable to one another, so mutual accountability, and for the reasons that Gwyn was pointing out, partly that, you know, if what reflects badly on one humanitarian agency reflects badly on all, and so it's important that we have an accountability to each other to work as well as we possibly can. And I think in that context, the piece by World Vision in here is very interesting about accountability to partners. So, arguably, quite a lot more accountability. Arguably, accountability is going in new directions, accountability in more directions. Why? Partly, probably, because of external factors. You know, the financial crisis makes donors need to show to tax-paying public that they are using money wisely, partly because the world marches on. The external factors such as technology, I'm sure, influence the accountability discussion, not only because there are new possibilities, as Gwyn pointed out, in terms of using these things as tools, but also if a lot of the accountability discussion is about showing that you're doing the right thing, showing that you are doing what you said you would do, it's a very different context if you're working sort of, 25 miles from the nearest road than if you're working in the middle of a city that is highly wired and you're being caught on Flickr and YouTube. And that sort of changes the context. It kind of forces us. We are accountable. We're much more visible. So external factors, but also internal factors. Also, I think, just because humanitarians want to be accountable. They want this to work. And because each, if you like, generation just builds on the achievements that have occurred from the last set of, we learn, hopefully, we learn from our successes and also from our mistakes. The learning doesn't come without some tensions in it. When you're learning a new sport, maybe at first just hitting the ball is a result. You're happy if you just knock the ball back over the net. As you get better at it, you discover that actually there are more complexities and more nuances and more. This thing is perhaps more difficult than it looked. And so I would suggest is the case with accountability. That the more work that is done in the more directions, the more difficulties and tensions we see arising, and many of them I think are well sort of explored in the HPN here. I'd like to just point up 4 very briefly that I think will probably increasingly are already challenging us and will probably challenge us increasingly until the next edition comes out. The first is an obvious one, but the fact it's obvious doesn't make it any less difficult. There is the tension between using money to actually do the work and demonstrating that the money has been used well. One of the scarcest resources in a humanitarian response is time, and responding takes time. Planning, programming takes time, and reporting on that takes time. And one thing that comes up quite a lot is that particularly humanitarian field workers feel they just don't have the time to do everything. And that's a tension. How do you get that balance right? The second, perhaps, is an emerging tension which already exists within the structures of many humanitarian organisations between the way things get done on the ground, the way things are done in the field, and the way things are done in London or New York or Rome or wherever it might be. And it's the question of to what degree are the things that we are learning from these feedback mechanisms, from these accountability mechanisms, really translate? And what would that need to look like to make that happen? If we're asking people for feedback, and this is particularly around beneficiary-related accountability, forward accountability, but if we're asking people for feedback, are our organisations structured in such a way that that feedback is changing organisational policy and strategy? Yeah? Or is it really just something which at best is changing things in the field? It's a tension which exists perhaps in the structural nature of the organisations, but how do we come around that? The third tension is between, I talked a minute ago about this web of accountabilities, and of course, that means that accountability pulls us in all kinds of different directions. You pull on one bit of the web, and it has to sort of give somewhere else. And I think, again, this is not an original point. It's something which I think many people feel. But Margie Buchanan-Smith, in the article here, talks about the tension between beneficiary to disaster-affected populations. Between accountability to disaster-affected populations and accountability to the donors. How do you, and it's something that Gwyn brought up just now, and it's wonderful to hear that the ISC is taking this forward, how simultaneously, and given that you probably have other things that you need to be doing as well, do you establish a way of doing what you said you would do in the log frame and taking into account the things that you are hearing beneficiaries want you to do? How do you simultaneously fulfill your commitment of being accountable to a donor to whom you said we will do this, and also take opportunities and risks as they arrive for the benefit of the population? And what do you do if you took a risk and it went wrong? Yeah? It's like so many things in humanitarian action, this isn't a discussion about a good or a bad. It's actually two goods, you know? Both of these things are good things to do. How do you deal with that? So that's attention. I think perhaps just in terms of tensions, in terms of pulling the web in different ways, another interesting one that's coming up is that there are tensions in this rather odd triangular relationship that exists between beneficiaries, their governments, and there are mutual accountabilities, of course, between the state and people in the state and the population, and the external international actor. When an NGO starts setting up a complaints mechanism, for example, and when that complaints mechanism starts collecting evidence around things which are actually crimes within the state, sexual abuse, for example, where do you draw that line? Yeah, again, it's difficult. It's tension. It's, you know, what is right and wrong here. The final tension is, and I'm getting my 1 minute. So, the final tension is just perhaps between different motivations. We do accountability for a variety of reasons. Some of those are functional because it makes, allegedly, it makes our work more effective or more efficient. I say allegedly because it would be wonderful if there was more evidence. I think there's a lot of examples, but it would be good to actually work on what the relationships between these accountability mechanisms and effectiveness are. But we also do it because it's the right thing to do. Now, what happens when doing something to make you effective and doing something because it's the right thing to do mean actually doing different things? For example, what happens when the right thing to do is perhaps around empowerment objectives, because taking some of the poorest and most marginalised people and bringing them into the conversation, but the effective thing to do is to talk to the existing power structures. Yeah? This is something, the more we do this, the more I think we butt up against these sort of issues. I hope that's not too obscure. The final thing I'd like to say is all these four tensions are amenable to work. And one of the things that I think we all know about our sector is that it's full of people who are ingenious and innovative and generally quite iconoclastic and occasionally good listeners. And it's more than possible that over the next short decade, all of these tensions will be satisfactorily addressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.